Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me thank the organizers for, first of all, having organized this wonderful conference and for having invited me to participate. And I'm delighted to be back at UNAM for another wonderful another wonderful conference. I apologize for speaking in English, but I will speak slowly. And Luis tells me that he's distributed the paper, which in English, which you can follow along, I hope. In the beginning of part 2 of the Ethics, after having introduced his account of mind as the idea of body, Spinoza turns to his account of sensation and imagination. He begins with the observation that, quote, the human mind is capable of perceiving a great many things, and is the more capable the more its body can be disposed in a great many ways. Then follows a series of propositions and scholia, in which Spinoza sets out an account of the way in which we become aware of bodies in the external world by way of their causal impingement on our own, and the changes that these impingements produce in our bodies. This sensory knowledge is what he will call knowledge of the first kind. That sensory knowledge involves the causal impingements of external things on the body. It's not surprising. But what is more surprising is that for Spinoza, the knowledge we have of our own bodies and minds comes, at least in the first instance, in the same way, from the ideas that we have of the impingement of external bodies on our minds. That's to say, we know ourselves through knowing external bodies. Later, as we move from knowledge of the first kind through knowledge of the second to intuition, or knowledge of the third kind, we gain a different kind of knowledge of ourselves, both more certain and more direct. But unlike for Descartes, for whom the direct intuitive access to the thinking self is, quote, the first and most certain of all truths to occur to anyone who philosophizes in an orderly way. For Spinoza, this direct knowledge of the self is an achievement that comes only at the end of a long and difficult process. So let me begin with my exposition. Minds, external bodies, and one's own body. First, some brief reminders about Spinoza's metaphysics, particularly as it relates to the human mind. For Spinoza, of course, there is only one substance, God. All other things are modes of God. Though Spinoza's God has multiple attributes, an infinity of them, in fact, we are only acquainted with two, extension and thought. And so Spinoza argues that the modes of extension, bodies, and the modes of thought, ideas, are in some sense identical to one another. And this is Ethics 2, Proposition 7. I've put the quotations on the handout, not in the order in which I read them, but in the order in which they come in the Ethics. So this is Ethics 2, Proposition 7, Scholium, which identifies the modes of extension and the modes of thought. It is in this context that Spinoza presents his account of mind and its relation to body. Proposition 11 of Part 2, the first thing that constitutes the actual being of a human mind is nothing but the idea of a singular thing which actually exists. And second of all, the object of the idea constituting the human mind is the body, or a certain mode of extension which actually exists, and nothing else. The human mind, then, is the idea of the human body. That is, the human mind and the human body are one and the same mode of substance, understood through different attributes. The body understood through extension, and the mind understood through thought. In order to understand the phenomenon of sense perception, Spinoza considers the human body as situated among other bodies in the world. Bodies external to mine impinge upon my body, causing changes in it. This impingement, what Spinoza calls an affectio, results in a state of my body which is jointly determined by the nature of the body impinging and by the nature of my own body. And this is Ethics 2, Proposition 16. The idea of any mode in which the human body is affected by external bodies must involve, and the Latin word there is involvere, the nature of the human body, and at the same time, the nature of the external body. In ordinary English, to involve is a very vague term. But I think that Spinoza means it here in a more precise and technical sense. Involvere in Latin is connected with volvere, to roll or wrap up. And in this context might be translated literally as to wrap up or envelop. I think that's what Spinoza means to be saying in this proposition, that the idea of a state of the human body affected by an external body has wrapped up within it, as it were, both the idea of the nature of the human body and the idea of the nature of the impinging body. So when I look out and I see a tree, something from the outside actually hits my body, causes a change. The change in my body is a joint result of the nature of the tree and the nature of my body. So the state then involves in this sense, envelops in this sense, both the nature of the tree and my own nature. At very least, I think Spinoza means that the state of my body as affected by an external body is a result both of my nature and the nature of the external thing impinging on it. But as we'll see below, I suspect that he also means to say that from a consideration of the idea of my body as externally impinged upon in that way, when I'm looking at the tree, I can recover a kind of knowledge both of my own nature and of the body that's externally impinging on me. And from this, Spinoza draws some conclusions. This is Ethics 2, Proposition 16, first corollary. From this, it follows first that the human mind perceives, percipere, the nature of a great many bodies together with the nature of its own. And I'll return to the notion of perception shortly. And in addition, and this is the second corollary to Proposition 16, it follows that the ideas which we have of external bodies indicant the condition of our own body more than the nature of the external bodies. What does Spinoza mean by nature here? The story is complicated and not entirely relevant to the main questions in my talk, so I'll go directly to my own reading without fully arguing for it. As I understand Spinoza, the nature of a body is given by, the term he uses is the ratio motus et quietus. The ratio in question, as I understand it, is not a numerical ratio, but a kind of definition or principle of organization broadly conceived, something that is fully consistent with the breadth and imprecision of the Latin word ratio. Very roughly, an individual is a collection of smaller parts that are organized in such a way that they maintain a constant relation or structure of motion and rest with respect to one another. That is a characteristic ratio motus et quietus. And this admittedly is something vague, but I suspect that Spinoza himself didn't know exactly what that structure might be like. I suspect that he thought of the ratio motus et quietus as a kind of placeholder for whatever homeostatic structures future generations might come to identify as the broadly mechanical relations among the parts of complex bodies that define their individuality. And this, I think, is what Spinoza has in mind when he talks about the nature of a body in the passages that I quoted earlier. So the state of the body after an impingement by an external body is defined by the rationes motus et quietus of the two bodies in question, my own human body and the external impinging body. After the impingement, the state of my body is jointly determined by the nature of the two bodies in question. When I sense a cup, for example, the resulting state of my body will be determined in part from my own ratio motus et quietus, and in part from the ratio of the cup. My sensation of the cup, then, is the idea of my body in this post-impingement state. In sensation, I learn about the nature of other bodies by the way in which they alter my own. This, in essence, is Spinoza's account of how our causal interactions with the world of external bodies gives rise to ideas we have of bodies outside of us. This is, by the way, what he calls imagination. The view is further clarified by comparing the idea that I have of my own body, what Spinoza considers my mind, with the idea of what a different person has of my body. This is what he writes, and this is Ethics to Proposition 17 Scholium. And this is a difficult but important passage. Ethics to Proposition 17 Scholium. Furthermore, we clearly understand what is the difference between the idea of, say, Peter, which constitutes the essence of Peter's mind. Remember, the mind of Peter is the idea of his body. And the idea of Peter, which is in another man, say Paul. Paul is regarding Peter and has an idea of Peter. For the former, that's to say, Peter's idea of himself, directly displays, directe explicat, the essence of Peter's body, and does not involve existence except so long as Peter exists. But the latter, okay, that's Peter's idea of himself, directly displays his nature. But Paul's idea of Peter, on the other hand, indicates the condition of Paul's body more than Peter's nature, and therefore, while that condition of Paul's body exists, Paul's mind will still regard Peter as present itself, even though Peter does not exist. Okay, so Peter's mind directly displays the nature of his body, whereas Paul's idea of Peter displays Paul's body as he is perceiving Peter. And it's important to note here another question about Spinoza's philosophical vocabulary. Explicare, which he uses when talking about Peter's idea directly displaying explicat, directe explicat, the nature, his own nature. Explicare is usually translated in English as to explain, and often that's exactly what it does mean. But when Spinoza here talks about an idea that directe explicat, the nature of a body, I think it's better understood as directly displays or directly exhibits that nature. Peter's idea of himself directly displays his own nature. What is important here is that Peter's idea of body, that's to say his mind, which is identical with the finite mode that is his body, but understood through the attribute of thought, directly displays the nature of his body. It's identical with his body, though grasped through a different attribute. But the idea of Peter, as it exists in Paul, is quite a different matter. As Spinoza puts it, it indicates the condition of Paul's body more than it does Peter's nature. It is just the idea of the state of Paul's body as it is impinged upon by light rays that come from Peter's body. As such, it is a state of Paul's body that by Proposition 16 involved the nature of Peter, though it doesn't display directa explicat that nature in the way in which Peter's idea of Peter does, of himself does. The relation between these two verbs is very interesting. Explicare is connected with the verb plicare, to fold or wind up. Literally, explicare could be translated as to unfold or unwind. And as I pointed out earlier, involvere, on the other hand, is connected with volvere, to roll up or wrap up. As such, explicare and involvere are, in a sense, exact opposites. Peter's idea of his own body directly unfolds his own nature, while Paul's idea of Peter's body envelops or wraps up the idea of Peter's nature. So in a certain sense, they are, and the contrast there is very important. Now this leads to the central question of the knowledge of self in Spinoza. The passage about Peter and Paul would seem to suggest that each individual has a privileged access to the nature of his or her own body. My mind directly displays the nature of my body in a way in which your idea of my body only involves the nature of my body, in the technical sense of including it in the idea of your body following the external impingement on your sense organs. That would seem to imply that Peter knows his own body in a direct and more certain way than Paul knows Peter's body. But matters are much more complicated than that. Peter's mind displays the nature of his own body, and by at least one definition of perception that Spinoza seems to give, one would suppose that it perceives his body as well. And this is Proposition 11 corollary from Part 2. When we say that the human mind perceives, this percipere, this or that, we are saying nothing but that God, not insofar as he's infinite, but insofar as he is displayed, explicator, through the nature of the human mind, or insofar as he constitutes the essence of the human mind, has this or that idea. So to perceive something is simply to have an idea. Indeed, on this definition of perception, because the mind contains ideas of all the parts of the body, the human mind perceives everything that happens in the body. And this is Proposition 12. Everything that goes on in the human body is perceived by the human mind. And this, of course, seems quite paradoxical. There is much that goes on in the human body that we don't seem to be aware of. For example, these secretions that are happening at this moment in my pancreas. How can Spinoza say that I'm perceiving that? Well, to resolve this apparent problem, we need to recognize that Spinoza distinguishes between perception and knowledge. Even though I perceive my body directly through an idea, that displays its nature. And even though I perceive everything that goes on in my body, Spinoza claims that I don't thereby have knowledge of it. And this is Ethics 2, Proposition 19. The human mind does not know, cognoscit, the human body itself, nor does it know, scit, that it exists. So it's cognoscere and scire, that it exists, except through the ideas of affections by which the body is affected. Though we have perceptions, those perceptions don't necessarily constitute knowledge. Why does Spinoza say this? As is often the case in the Ethics, later use of earlier propositions offer important clarifications of what the earlier text means. Later in the Ethics, Spinoza makes reference back to Proposition 19, the one we were just looking at, as well as to Proposition 23, which we'll come to briefly, giving a paraphrase that clarifies the matters in an interesting way. And this is Ethics 3, Proposition 30, demonstration. Man, by Ethics 2, Proposition 19, and Ethics 2, Proposition 23, is conscious, conscious, of himself through the affections by which he is determined to act. This suggests that in Proposition 19 of Part 2, knowledge, both cognoscere and scire, entails conscious awareness. This suggests that for Spinoza, mere perception does not necessarily entail conscious awareness. The suggestion seems to be that the perceptions in the mind of which we are consciously aware are those that derive from external impingements of external bodies, while other perceptions that we may have are not conscious. Strange as this may seem, put in its proper context, it is not unprecedented. There is a long history, both before and after Spinoza, of philosophers who thought that perception was widespread in nature, even in inanimate things, though not necessarily conscious. And you can find views like this, for example, in Talesio, in Francis Bacon, and later on in Leibniz. And I think that this is the solution to the problem. How can I be perceiving everything that goes on in my body if I'm not conscious of it? Perception does not entail consciousness for Spinoza. And if indeed Spinoza does hold this view, then we have a ready resolution of the problem noted earlier about the implausibility of supposing that I perceive everything that goes on in my body. Now, an interesting consequence of what he's saying is that the only thing that I'm conscious of are perceptions that derive from external impingements. So I am aware of what it is that I'm sensing, or the state of my body that is due to the external impingements of, say, light. That's to say, my sensations, but I'm not necessarily aware of other things that are going on in my body. Now, an interesting consequence of this discussion is that for Spinoza, even though my mind is the idea of my body and displays its nature in the sense discussed earlier, the idea that Peter has of his body displays fully the nature of his body. Nevertheless, I don't have privileged access to my body. Even though Peter's idea of his own body is completely different from Paul's idea of Peter's body, Peter's knowledge of his own body, what he's aware of, isn't all that different from Paul's. Neither is Peter's knowledge of his own body that much different from his knowledge of external bodies. Peter knows external bodies through sensation. The idea he has of a tree in front of him involves the nature of this tree. But that same sensory experience also involves the nature of his own body. And Spinoza claims that's exactly the way he has cognitive access to the nature and existence of his own body. His claim that Peter is only consciously aware of the nature of his own body when he is in a state of sensory awareness of something outside of himself, such as the tree. I only know myself when I'm looking at something outside of myself, when I'm aware of something outside of myself. And just as his knowledge of the nature of the tree is involved in that sensory state, so is his own nature involved in that sensory state. Knowledge of both is thoroughly causal, known only because of the causal processes that constitute sensory connection with the external world, which puts Peter in a state that involves both his own nature and the nature of the tree. And because of the unavoidable mixture of knowledge of his and my nature with knowledge of external things, in both cases, the knowledge is inadequate. So far, we have been examining Spinoza's views on my knowledge of my own body. But my mind is the idea of my body. So these observations extend directly to my knowledge of my own mind as well. And this is proposition 23. The mind does not know itself except insofar as it perceives the ideas of the affections of the body. And the argument, of course, draws directly on proposition 19, as one might expect. The idea is that just as the idea of my body comes to me mixed with the ideas I have of external bodies, the idea I have of the idea of my body, that is, the idea I have of my mind, comes to me in the mix with the ideas we have of external bodies. And again, later references to this proposition establish that by cognitio here, Spinoza has in mind conscious awareness. In addition to proposition 30 of part 3, where Spinoza interprets proposition 23 in terms of conscious awareness, there's also a reference in Ethics 3, proposition 9, demonstration. By mind, the mind, by Ethics 2, proposition 23, is necessarily conscious of itself through ideas of the body's affections. Just as I'm aware of my own body through the ideas of the external impingements on it that I am aware of my mind. That is, I have a conscious idea of my body through the same ideas of external impingements. And this seems to be a direct response to Descartes and the strategy of the cogito. For Descartes, I discover myself by shutting my eyes, stopping my ears, withdrawing from all of my senses. This is the beginning of the second meditation, where he discovers the self. But for Spinoza, it's exactly the opposite. And for a Cartesian, deeply shocking. It is only because of my causal engagement with the outside world that I have the cognitive access that I do to my own mind. The story isn't quite over yet. The kind of causal knowledge of ourselves and the world that's at issue in the beginning of Ethics 2 is what Spinoza calls knowledge cognitio of the first kind, which includes knowledge derived from singular things which have been represented to us through the senses in a way that is mutilated, confused, and without order for the intellect. If we consider, and this is also imagination, of course, if we consider only knowledge of the first kind, then this is how we can know ourselves through our senses. That is, through the ideas, though the ideas of things as they impinge on our bodies. The nature of our bodies is mixed up with the nature of external things, and that happen to act on our bodies. But of course, knowledge of the first kind is notoriously inadequate. Quote, this is Ethics 2, Proposition 41 demonstration. To knowledge of the first kind pertain all those ideas which are inadequate and confused, and so this knowledge is the only cause of falsity. As we progress toward knowledge of the third kind, what Spinoza calls intuition, the ultimate goal of the ethics, our knowledge of self evolves as well. At the end of part 5 of the ethics, Spinoza writes, this is Ethics 5, Proposition 31, Scholium. Therefore, the more each of us is able to achieve in this kind of knowledge, that's knowledge of the third kind, the more he is conscious of himself and of God. That is, the more perfect and blessed he is. In the beginning of the project, when we are just sorting things out through knowledge of the first kind, we have a knowledge of our bodies and our minds through the causal process of sensation and imagination. We know ourselves, body and mind, through the same means as we know the external world. But by the end of Spinoza's project, through intuition, knowledge of the third kind, we come to a different, deeper, and more adequate knowledge of ourselves. I don't want to suggest that even at the end, the conception of mind that we attain is very close to Descartes' conception of mind. For Spinoza, the mind is always the idea of the body and always complex, composed of ideas of the parts of the body of which it is an idea. It is an intuitive grasp, not of a simple and indivisible thinking substance, but of the essence of body conceived sub specie aeternitatis. However, like Descartes' cogito, it is a direct intuitive grasp of the mind through intuition. But whereas it is the first thing known in Descartes, the beginning of knowledge, it is among the final attainments in Spinoza. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dan, for your paper. It's really, really interesting, and it's it gives us a lot of things to think on. I will only want to say two things and then start the question and answers section. I would like to know if, well, for one part, it's very helpful to clarify the position between explicare and involvere. Could you say more about the concept of nature in Spinoza? I know you said in your paper that it was not the point, but it's really interesting to know a little bit about what you think on the concept of nature, how it is working on between these two. And the other thing, it will be also interesting to know if you could say more between the relation between impingement, bodily affection, corporeal organization, ratio, and at the same time the existence of the body, the actual existence. So the difference of the body of a child and the body of that person when it's older, the difference between the existence will be also related with perceptions that this person has about the world and the relations it has with the bodies that there are outside. So
okay, those are both enormous questions. but
You have 2 minutes.
let me begin with the second question. And can you remind me again what that is? The relation between.
First of all, what happens with nature, the concept of nature,
right?
And the other one, the relation with existence. With actual existence of the human body or of the mind, with the impingement, the bodily affections.
I'm not sure that I really understand that question. I mean, the body can only be impinged on if it exists, right? Exactly.
But how it changes its existence after the impingement. So it doesn't, because it sounds impingement like if it was only something that happens upon, from the outside, and that the body does not change.
Well, the body, no. The thing is, I think what Spinoza has in mind, and their word is affectio, that he uses in Ethics 2. And it's important, of course, to keep that different from affectus, which is the term that he uses for the emotions in Ethics 3. But an affectio is literally an odd, something that is, that happens to a body from the outside, right? And I think that when he talks about the affectiones of the body, what he has in mind is the impingement, the literal physical impingement of the physical world on the body, mainly through the sense organs, right? When I look at the tree out there, my body, there is something that comes from the tree that affects my sense organs. When I'm looking at it, primarily, of course, the eyes, but there are other sense modalities as well, touch and hearing and things like that change other parts of the body. And these cause literally physical changes in the body. And I think what Spinoza has in mind here is the accounts of sensation that were already widely discussed, in Descartes, in Hobbes, that the human body is a complex of parts that is changed by external bodies acting on it. Now, you ask about the difference between a child and an adult. Obviously, the child's body is different from the adult's, and the same external impingements may well affect it differently, which is why it is that children and adults may react differently. We are conditioned in part by our memories, by this comes up later on in the ethics, as well as in Descartes, as well as in Hobbes, which I think Spinoza is drawing on. And so, for example, the memories that one has and the associations that one has will affect will be different and give you a different response. Now, as far as the question of the nature goes, that's actually a very, as you know, a very difficult question. So the idea of a ratio, motus equietus, is first introduced fairly early in Spinoza, in writings that are connected with his short treatise, and there it does look like a numerical ratio. But by the time you get to the ethics, I think it is connected with a definition of an individual, where he does talk about, I can't remember the exact formula, but that an individual has a characteristic structure, basically, and this is in the physical treatise in part 2, and then later as he develops it, and the example there is, the big example I think is the Spanish poet later in I think it's Ethics 4, and he seems to think that there is this thing that he calls the ratio motus equietus, which remains constant always, which defines you as the individual that you are, and you can grow from being a child to an adolescent to an adult, and it will remain the same. And as long as it remains the same, you are the same individual that you are. And the claim that it is a configuration of parts with a characteristic relation to one another is an interpretation, but I think it's a very plausible interpretation of what it is that Spinoza has in mind. He doesn't say what that structure is, because I don't think he has any idea what exactly the structure is, nor does it matter. I mean, it's a scientific question that somebody will discover later what exactly it is that makes Luis, Luis, and me, and But the thing is, it's standing in. He is committed to the idea that, at least under the attribute of extension, it's going to be a configuration of relations of size, shape, and motion of the parts that remains constant.
Thank you very much. So we start with the section of questions and answers, and will be Enrique. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. This is fascinating and very clear. And here's another big question, if I may. But I'm sure you can tell it very briefly. So in your story here, and I find fascinating, right, this contrast with Descartes, right, how what comes first for him, right, comes last. I thoroughly appreciate that. So how do we get in your story, right, it's a story from knowledge of the first kind to
Knowledge of the third kind. How do we get there? That's the big question in Spinoza. I don't have a better answer than anybody else does, but this I think is, I think it is, first of all, realizing that knowledge of the first kind is defective, and coming to appreciate, what he says. For example, in the appendix to part 1 of the Ethics, where he talks about superstition and imagination, and how from the mistakes that we have about our own belief in freedom of the will, we assume that nature works like we think we work. Right, and he says we would have been forever doomed to living in this superstitious world had we not the model of mathematics that we could use. And I think that gives us the, at least the passage to knowledge of the second kind, when we realize that there's something defective about knowledge of the first kind. And we have this other model that luckily has been historically discovered, and realize that it's useful for more than just geometry, right? And it can be a model of knowledge in general. That gets us to knowledge of the second kind. But of course, how we go from there to knowledge of the third kind, and even for that matter, what exactly knowledge of the third kind is one of the great mysteries in Spinoza, and I don't have any real insight on that.
Okay, so sí, Pedro.
Daniel, thank you very much for your talk. It's a great pleasure. When you start to explain the solution of this problem of how it is possible that mind is the idea of body, if we don't realize what's going on in each part of the body. You say perception is different from knowledge.
Yes.
And the supposition is that perception is more related to this idea that the mind is the idea of the body, that the mind express in some sense is the expression of the body, or unfolds the body. In Ethics 11, Proposition 11, to perceive is to say, when we say that the human mind perceives this or that, we are saying nothing but that God has this or that idea.
Yeah.
And that means that when we perceive something, we grasp God's ideas or something like that. And on the other side, perception in Proposition 23, when it perceives the ideas of the affection of the body, seems to me more related to what we normally understand by perception, related with some causal relation with body. So it seems to me that there is some kind of ambiguity in the word perception. And what concerns me more is, where is the relation of representation? Where those representations comes in this story? At the side of perception or at the side of knowledge?
Yeah.
That's
Those are excellent questions. The fact is that Spinoza is not entirely unambiguous in his use of perception. And to make the story simple, I put the other conception of perception in a long footnote. So what I'm giving is, I think, one strand of Spinoza's thought, and I think that he was not himself altogether clear about this, but I think that there is a coherent position there that he was clarifying, at least. And now you look at proposition. Well, proposition 11 corollary seems to indicate that to perceive is simply to have an idea.
Yeah.
Right? If I have an idea in my mind, then I'm perceiving it. But to have an idea in Spinoza's sense is simply for, well, my mind is the idea of my body, and to have an idea in my mind is simply to have a mode of thought as part of my mind, which corresponds to a particular part of my body. Right. Now, proposition 23 looks as if it's using perception in the wider sense, that to perceive something is to be aware of it.
Yeah.
But I think that when you put that together with those comments from Ethics 3, those two propositions from Ethics 3, it suggests that it's only certain perceptions that constitute being conscious, right? So yes, you don't know yourself insofar as you perceive the ideas of the affections of the body, but you're actually only aware of the perceptions of the affections of the body. You're not aware of all of the other perceptions in the mind. I think that's the way in which I would read it. So I think it is, and if you just read proposition 23 without the other propositions, you could certainly think that he was using perception in such a way that to perceive something is to be aware of it. But I think that the clarification in Ethics 3 from those two passages in Ethics 3 suggests that there is a distinction between knowledge and between perception that constitutes knowledge and perception that doesn't constitute knowledge. Say perception of which we're conscious and perception of which we're not. Though what's remarkable is how little Spinoza talks about consciousness, right? There are only a few passages in the Ethics where he talks about consciousness, and those are two of the most important ones. And they are stuck in demonstrations, right? So they're not things that he is, I don't think he has a real theory of consciousness, But if you wanted to look for an antecedent, I think that you might find it in Hobbes, who does think that, that thoughts are motions in the brain, but the only motions in the brain that we are aware of are those that come to us, or the main motions that ideas that we're aware of are motions that come to us from external stimulation. And I think that that's where it is that Spinoza is coming from here. Now, there are all sorts of motions in the brain for Hobbes, but what are we aware of? Well, when I look at the tree and it changes something, and then that makes the motion salient in a way. Although Hobbes's theory of consciousness is even more mysterious, I think, than Spinoza's. But I hope that
Oh, yeah.
helps.
Representation?
Representation.
Well, I don't know whether I can you saying something. Is there something like representation in the relation of perception and the idea, or being aware?
Yeah, I think
Because there is the relation of expression, in some sense, mind express, in some sense, body.
it is the idea of the body.
Idea of body. In that sense,
Right.
it expresses the body. But
Right.
the relation of representation is more a relation from the mind to the body. So
From the mind to the body.
does Spinoza takes seriously the idea of representation, or
That the mind
it doesn't
represents
come in
the
this
body.
concept?
Yes, I think he does. But the closest he comes is I think in proposition 16. The idea of any mode by which the human body is affected by external bodies must involve the nature of the human body and at the same time the nature of the external body. And of course, my idea of my body when it's in that state will then involve an idea of my nature as well as an idea of the nature of the external body when I'm looking at the tree. And to that's as much as I can find of a theory of representation. Beg pardon?
The external body when I'm looking at.
So let's go on with the other questions. Bueno, no tenemos entonces mucho tiempo. Gustavo y después Soraya. Y ya estás.
Okay. I wonder to what extent the Spinoza theory is similar to William James's theory of emotions. James says that to have an emotion is be aware of a bodily symptom. Yeah, so I know that I'm sad because I'm crying. We usually think it's the other way around. But well, there are a certain number of objections to this theory, so I wonder to what extent these objections also apply to Spinoza's theory. One of them, for instance, is that you can have a certain bodily symptom and you may not know exactly if it's, I don't know, if it's just a heartburn or a certain, or that you're in a certain emotional state. But also, another objection would be that if an emotion is, if we try to reduce an emotion to its sensory bodily symptoms, then we have a question about intentionality. Yeah. Because my emotion, the intentional logic of my emotion doesn't seem to be a certain state of a person or but my bodily symptom. And that state of affairs seems to cause this symptom. When, whereas we usually think that the intentional object of my emotion is not my bodily symptom. It's a certain state of affairs in the world. So, can you say?
Yeah, I could. I think Spinoza's theory of the emotions is not going to be exactly like William James. It might look from his discussion of the imagination, like it might be, like the idea, like each of the emotions is going to be the idea of the body in a particular state. But he defines the emotions, and the word that he uses there is affectus, as basically appetitive states, which is to say desire or will or those are the basic, that is the basis of emotions for Spinoza. The idea, and they come from the conatus that we have for self-preservation. So all of the emotions are ultimately, for Spinoza, connected with the striving toward self-preservation, which I also, by the way, I mean, you raised the question about Spinoza and his idea of human nature and the ratio motus equietis. I think part of the idea of the ratio motus equietis, this structure that defines me as the person that I am, it is the source of the striving for self-preservation. And so I guess in a certain sense, an emotion is going to be the state of the body in a state of striving. But not every state is going to constitute, right? So for example, a state of having heartburn is not necessarily going to be a state of striving toward self-preservation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Y por último, Soraya.
Very brief. Thank you very much for your presentation. This involutive and explicatio that you mentioned, they remind me of Cusa and implicatio, explicatio. Do you think he's using involutive in the very same sense as a synonym of implicatio? Can this be somehow related?
Well, explicare and implicare both have the same root, applicare, but the opposite, prefixes. I'm not sure that he knew Cusa, but I remember Spinoza's education was a little bit strange. He didn't come to Latin until he was fairly old, and it's not clear what of the sort of earlier philosophy he had read and what it is that he had. But I actually think, when you go back to classical Latin, these words implicare, explicare, involvere have a much richer meaning than they came to have a little bit later. And I think that Spinoza and probably Cusa as well are just simply going back to the original classical meanings of the term.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much for your time.